Freddie, I wonder if there's anything you've identified. Are there any explicit Trump policies? And this is a question from Fabian or Fabienne. I apologise. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. Whether parties here in the UK are going to replicate any sort of specific Trump policies. Do you see that happening?
Everyone's familiar with the importation of tonal politics and symbolic politics, and we've seen that on the right and we've seen it on the left. What might be slightly more concrete is the importation of something looking like an acceptance of bilateralism over multilateralism. I think
unpick that a bit for me. What do you mean?
So Trump's essentially rejecting the UN ecosystem, and he's done that by leaving the WHO. We've seen this criticism of the ICC, which is not part of the UN, but it's part of this international ecosystem of organizations over the past 20 years. That's really coming to a head now. Trump sees foreign policy in a purely bilateral basis. He will negotiate with other countries through Twitter and through tariffs. We're seeing this right now with China. He's threatening China with tariffs so that he can get the CCP to allow ByteDance to sell off TikTok. He's not going to the WTO or whatever it might be, or the UN to talk about these things. He's doing it on Twitter. So an acceptance in the UK about realizing that the bilateral negotiations is the way in which this administration will work will be extremely helpful for them. Same with tariffs. I mean, that's just the forum in which it happens is completely different now. So that might have to change in the UK.
Will there be a knock-on effect from Trump's rights rollback or from the US leaving the WHO? Who wants to take that one?
Well, on the US leaving the WHO, that's a whole lot of funding. I think it's provides over 10% of the WHO's funding. But it's a good thing that we haven't had, a global pandemic that transcended borders where we needed international cooperation. So that seems fine to me. Obviously the Paris Climate Accord is kind of a major one because it's even harder. It's going to be even harder for governments, the UK and Europe and others, to make the kind of changes necessary for net zero if their opponents can say, look, even America isn't doing this. We knew that China and India, which are some of the biggest polluters, weren't playing ball with us and America's not. It's just a kind of major attitude shift that's going to come into our politics and the political discourse. What's the point of Britain making itself poorer is the argument when all the other big polluters are not. I also think the diversity, equality and inclusion being sort of held up as the bogeyman, the sort of anti-woke target. And it is here in the UK too. Kemi Badenoch has given lots of speeches, both when she was running for the Conservative leadership and since, about the ways in which businesses are less productive because they're tied up in initiatives around diversity or excessive regulation, and that she draws a distinction between the productive parts of the economy and the parts of the economy, the people who are doing all of that and holding things back. So I think that's already here, and it's going to be turbocharged by, look, America is chucking all of that stuff out and their growth rate is better and their economy is doing well and ours isn't, and this is what's holding it back.
I mean, Freddie, the Democrats got a real kick in the mouth about this. They just weren't where the public are at on some of those issues. And while it's used as a terrible political football, there's some truth in this. I mean, how are Labour, is there a lesson here for how Labour respond to some of the excesses, if you like, of progressivism?
Progressivism.
Thank you.
I definitely, yeah, of course. I mean, the politics around the West has been moving in this direction for a very long time. Labour still went into the 2024 general election with a promise to have a Race Relations Act in their manifesto, which was essentially it accepted the premise of systemic racism. It promised ethnic pay gap reporting and monitoring, things like that. So there is this complete disjunction. I mean, you can't have a more symbolic difference than Labour promising that at the general election, Donald Trump on his first day in office, telling every DEI officer to work from home on paid leave. So I do think that's part of the problem, and it will impact the way in which the MAGA movement sees the UK. I mean, if you speak to them here, It's quite embarrassing. There's almost like a pity in their eyes, or a mocking remark about where the UK is right now. There is so little respect for the UK, but also for the Labour government. And I think, of course, these things feed into that because they're aware of it.
I want to stand up just very, very briefly because one of the things that the UK has and the America doesn't have is paid proper maternity leave. I think in America, maybe in some states you get two weeks. And obviously like companies offer more. But, America is facing a very similar birth rate fertility crisis to we are. And I think when we talk about DEI kind of stuff, people immediately assume it's giving jobs to people purely on behalf of their gender or their ethnicity. And actually, a lot of the time it's, would we like people to have more children? Maybe we shouldn't make women go back into the office 2 weeks after giving birth. So, like, there is a case for this.
No, the positive case needs to be made more loudly. I mean, Rachel, do you think? I mean, Tommy explicitly asks us: will Starmer move to the right?
I mean, you speak to some people on the left in this country, and they would say he already has. I think. The key framing for understanding how Labour reacts to all of this is they want to have a good as possible relationship with the US because they can't really move that much closer to Europe without getting into a big row about undoing Brexit. China's kind of off limits, although they're trying to be slightly warmer towards China as well, but for all the reasons that we have discussed at length on this podcast. And that kind of leaves the US. They want to have a good relationship. There is a hope that the talk of tariffs, Trump's talk of tariffs, either he won't do it or if he does do it, the UK will kind of be spared. I mean, George has pointed out in Morning Call this week that Trump doesn't like the US having trade deficits with countries, but actually they've got a trade surplus with the UK. And obviously his grandmother was Scottish and he loves the royal family. So, maybe
it says more about our ability to export, I think.
I agree entirely, but maybe that will kind of mean that the first tranche of tariffs are not aimed at us. But there is a question for Starmer on growth versus all the other stuff that it wants to do. You're seeing that at the moment on growth and climate change with the row over the Heathrow runway, which I know isn't directly about Trump, but I think it's useful to think about in sort of framing terms, because if what Trump is doing is saying the economy matters more than anything else, drill, baby, drill, forget any of these environmental concerns. That is a direct quote. Forget any of the environmental concerns. This is what we're doing. And as a result, the American economy booms even more. I mean, it's doing pretty well at the moment, but it's really positive for the American economy. And we're stuck here going, yay, we have 0.1% growth. Our economy isn't technically in recession. Is that going to change the calculation within the Starmer government on going for growth versus meeting net zero? And I think that conversation's already happening, but having that example over in the US very vividly might change the stakes slightly.